Hello, Poggers, and welcome to another episode of the Pogstate. We are so incredibly close to the finals. Only 2 more best of 5s do remain, and now it is time for the finals version of the Pogstate. And the best of 5s we've had so far have been incredible. Our new format has been super cool. Lower brackets, stuff like this, certainly has been awesome. Some of the series have been better than some of the others, and we're going to begin today by having a bit of a chat about what has happened thus far, the journeys that our teams have been on, and which teams have fallen by the wayside in the process. So, gentlemen, we're going to have to do it at some point. We have to talk about KT versus Live Sandbox.
I don't know.
All right.
I don't know if we really need to talk about
Valdes
it.
can start first because
have
he wants to get it out of the way.
We have to do every best of 5 that was played.
It's
and this
the first one on the list right
This
here.
one was
Yeah.
one of the best of 5s that was played.
Yeah.
It was you and I, right?
We just
meant-
wouldn't use the word best.
We were
It's
casting
an
this.
of 5.
Yeah, I meant metaphorically.
Okay.
we don't need to give too much attention to it
Okay,
because
well, KT Rolster have this issue where sometimes, even though they are a great team, when they are playing up against a weaker team, they decide, well, we're not going to play at our best. We were going to draft crazy things, and Huni was trying to give them a lot of credit by saying, hey, they're just practicing stuff. It's Live Sandbox. They think they're much better than them, and it turns out they were.
They were.
Didn't have to be a 3-1. Probably could have been a 3-0. We saw Urgot and all sorts of weird shenanigans. And that's pretty much all I remember from the series. I think I blanked out the rest of it because I wasn't very happy with the play. Not from Live Sandbox and definitely not from KT because I thought, okay, now this just means that KT is not going to be good in playoffs. Turns out they were, and
But
that
we
their
didn't
form
know
on the
that.
day was just really bad.
We might need to have like a thing that comes up that says like what Huni said and what Huni really means on the right
what
side
did he
as well.
mean by that?
And like I watched that series where I was desking that day with Atlus because you guys were casting it, and I remember watching the series just thinking from the lens of I believe I even predicted KT 3-0. I just knew okay KT's going to win this.
Same.
I looked at the series
Yeah.
not as like will KT win, but how will they win and how dominant will they look? And I think they disappointed in that regard. Like we saw some cool drafts from them, but they didn't actually push their macro leads. They were ahead in basically every game, but didn't actually force early barons like we've seen our top teams like Genji and T1 do. So it was very concerning. I think when we were watching that series going, oh, like this team looks a little bit lost with their advantages. They are the better team, but it's going to be an issue when T1 picks them is what I was thinking from the lens of what was happening in that series. And we'll talk about what happened with that later, but I was like, after that series, I thought, oh, 100% T1 picks them. I thought before the series T1's going to pick them, but after that series, I was like, doesn't matter what happens in the other series, T1 is picking this team for sure.
Yeah, that's the really the only thing that needs to be said about that series is that it made KT look like they should be picked by T1.
It was
that's
mind
actually
games.
that's actually the main takeaway. Sandbox, we knew they were really going to struggle. I think they're the only team where we didn't even consider the potential in our previous episode of them having a run, and that was very justified. They had like the one game where they kind of flipped heads on I think it was Closer doing really well.
Yeah.
But outside of that, yeah, there just wasn't that much to say. Like, KT didn't look great, but Sandbox were very clearly worse. It was like Afrika/Kwangdong last year, I think, or maybe the year before, where it was like very clear gap between the team that makes 6, even with Brion, I think this kind of applied, and then the teams above it.
Yeah, I would agree. So the one thing that I remember is honestly the drive by Fear Beyond Death.
That was
That's
great.
all I
That's a
remember.
highlight moment.
Yeah.
So me and Valdes
That's it.
on the same page. We're like, oh, that
That's
was
the only thing.
that was cute when Bertel
was funny.
carried the Urgot so that he got a double fear onto the bottom laners, and that's about like it does kind of sum up how that series went. It was like a dominant KT 3-1, and a bit of a meme at the same time, and so. We can now move on to our second best of 5. And
This one, there's a lot to say, I feel
yeah,
like.
this is actually the one where all of our writing on whiteboards just got obliterated. And so we had the beautiful whiteboard from last time. We were setting up exactly who we were thinking was going to go where in the playoffs, and this is where it all fell apart. So Hummer Life Esports got the upset over D+. And the thing that I don't like about this series is the fact that now that Hummer Life have been eliminated from the playoffs, what have we learned? Like, what is it? What does it mean? Like,
D plus just wasn't good at all, and we can talk about their form at the end of the split. And obviously some credit will have to be given from Hanwha Life, but seeing how Hanwha Life performed both against Gen G and against KT today, that's, I think, the only conclusion you can draw. I think that series alone doesn't really tell us that much, but when taken into consideration, and this is something that I think you and me mostly from the top, Matt, I don't know how Wolf and Valdes felt, but we were like, D+ can maybe get some stuff done. Even though their last 2 weeks were bad, and then it turned out, no, their last 2 weeks were very indicative of how the team was going to play.
Yeah, they were against Gen G and T1 in their final week, right?
Yeah. But even the week before that, I think they were like so-so. Or maybe the week before that they were better. Regardless, like the form that they showed individually was just, they got leads and then nothing happened ever.
Yeah, I didn't hate their series against T1, but I thought, okay, we do have to talk about like the fact that they did have that incredibly hard week. Normally you would be like, well, we can forgive them, like it's the beginning of or the end of like round 1 or something like that, but it's right before playoffs, and these are teams that you will face in playoffs. So, we did have to like really look at it, the lens of like, okay, well, you potentially will face one of these teams, at least potentially both, if you're going to make the run all the way to the end, right? And the Gen G series was the more telling one for me, where I was like, okay, this didn't look good. The T1 series, I thought they looked better. The Gen G series, not so much. And, I've been saying it all season long. Like, I thought that Deft and the team haven't operated as well when they don't have bot side control. There was a little bit of that in that series against HLE, but I think that it was mostly just D+ weren't all on the same page. Their team fighting was really poor. And Hanwha Life Esports have great team fighting, especially when they could front to back. And Damwon, or rather D+, kind of play around pick-based comps where they have like Kana on Renekton, or they have the Cassante engaged with Kana and they pull somebody out of a fight and then they win a 5v4. When they had to go toe-to-toe with Hanwha Life Esports, even though in Atlus and I's opinion, because we casted, were like, these are great drafts for D+, like they absolutely can win this. They've got lane prio, they have all the right win conditions. They fought into like a Yasuo before the comp was online, and they just constantly took bad fights, and it was very bizarre. It was just really like their brains were turned off.
I remember that game. I just like as a cold sweat. Yeah, the game one where they
the dragon.
Fought, the dragon fight. That was actually that was to me like the Birtle moment, right? That's the most iconic moment of that series.
Yeah,
where it's I think it was the first game and had a pretty good draft.
First game, first dragon,
and had like a decent early setup, and then they literally just punted like 2 or 3 kills into Viper Seri, and then that was the game.
I think that was the series ender.
Yeah. It really does feel like it was a big mental battle for DK, right? Like, Hanwha Life Esports were coming into it as the underdogs. They are great at just sitting back and kind of relaxing, and sometimes that gets the better of them. Like, in the early game, they fall behind. But in this case against DK were, like, scrambling after a really bad week, came in, kind of threw the first fight horribly. Like, their mental must have been all over the place. And I think after that, even though on paper they were the better team and they did get one win, and Showmaker tried very hard to carry on LeBlanc and stuff like that, just didn't matter, because Hanwha Life, I think, were the better prepared and less tiltable team on that day.
Yeah, I feel like DK have been suffering a little bit from over-expectation. I think that's something that Canyon and Showmaker have been struggling with for a really long time, but you add Def to that as well, who has struggled with this in the past. I think it was pretty sad seeing how susceptible to emotional damage the team was, and hopefully they can use the time off before summer to get things back together, but it wasn't it. It was also the best Hanwha had performed.
Yeah, Zeka was still in that series. That was cool.
He turned up for that one. He also turned up, I think Zeka turned up for like a couple of games in the Gen G series, and then never made it back.
One thing I do think, and this is similar to how I feel about Hanwha, is that the one thing this playoffs does show me is that I can see D+ be a good team in summer. Like, not necessarily a competitor, but it feels like their issues are very solvable if they can figure out if the meta fits them right. Like, we still see
they're
all
good enough players. We know that.
And I think that Hanwha, especially having seen their whole journey, kind of give me the same feeling. Although I think there's a little bit more. It's a little bit more individual performance that we might need to talk about. But I'm gonna.
We will get to that series, unfortunately. We will get to that series. That will happen.
A lot of foreshadowing.
Yes, indeed. But we get to talk about a fun one. Because the next best of 5 that we had was the Telecom War, which was dope. It was a big old banger. But getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, because there was one last thing I wanted to mention and to head towards the T1 side of the matchup, because obviously, T1 have been doing very well here in the playoffs, dropping 3 games so far against, a couple against KT and then 1 against Gen G, but looking like the better team. Having that air of inevitability, I think, remaining pretty strong for T1, in my opinion. But Faker has looked extraordinary.
Yeah.
He's been blowing my mind. Like, we've been celebrating his 10-year anniversary of his debut for a really long time. And, man, how does he just keep getting better? Like, it's dumb. Like, so much of our experience talking about League of Legends pro players is that there's often that cutoff, right, where you get too old. We've had a lot of players that have retired saying things like, "Oh, I'm just too old for this now. I'm not able to do it." Greats like Mata, Score, Ambition, blah blah blah. So many.
Gorilla.
But Faker just keeps going, and keeps like making these incredible plays, and you're like, "Well, are you a robot? Like, what is going on here?"
He trusts his team. I think he trusts this roster so much that like he will make big plays because he knows his team's going to follow up on it, and it allows him to do things that are almost impossible or unthinkable or seem risky and almost sometimes like inting or stupid.
Like crazy, yeah.
Yeah, and you're like, what? He can't be there. But the rest of his team is there to help him out, and then he turns what looks like Faker is caught into T1 get 3 kills in a turret.
Yeah.
And stuff like that. And some of his engages, his Lissandra, for example, his Gragas, he will just throw his life away to win the game because his team is going to back him up every time. The communication is so crisp on this roster, from the Guma Varus like smites, which you see all the time. Like, this team has stolen so many objectives with this. Obviously, you go back to the World's Finals, like it was there too. This is just not a coincidence. Like, this team is just so well prepared for these types of moments, and Faker has all of the information, like more information than any player or caster or analyst has, like ever. He has all of that in his head, and he can convey it quickly to a young roster that's got the fast hands to make the plays happen after he just, claws in with a flash and sets up for a Ring of Frost. Like, that's not the hard part, It's just knowing that that's the moment. That's the hard part. Like, the hands part of that, like, I'm not saying Faker doesn't have hands, by the way. That's another topic, but I think he definitely still has hands. But, like, what he is doing is he is the brain, and, like, he's the shot caller, and he's making these insane plays, and the team just doesn't disappoint when he does it.
I think it's pretty interesting that, over the last couple of years, Faker on the same or similar roster, he was always, like, the brains. We always called him the brains and stuff, and he was, like, always telling the kids what to do. He's very consistent, right? But he wasn't really making these super flashy, like, crazy engage plays that he's making this time. So I feel like that's kind of an interesting evolution from last year, where it was starting at the end of last year, obviously, going into World Finals and stuff and Worlds. But, like, now, like you were saying, Wolf, now it's like, okay, he feels unlocked. Like, he feels like he can give 100% trust rather than, like, 80% trust. So that's why he's making all of these crazy plays, because he knows they're going to happen. Like, he was always capable of it, but now it's happening more often, and he's getting all these POGs because he's doing crazy engages that basically nobody does.
And maybe he needs to do less communication now as well, just because he's been playing with this roster for so long.
Yeah, I actually do think it's also a testament to, and this also, of course, is never very cut and dry, but the testament to the value of playing together with the same roster for a longer amount of time. Another example, actually, I'd argue, is 2021 Gen G, because that team individually had like a couple of moments where they didn't look that great, and had been together for a while, right? And then that Worlds run that they made was so far beyond what was expected from them. And I think this current T1 roster is that, but then everyone's way better. So it's just kind of unfair. I want to talk about Gen G as well, but the only thing I wanted to add to T1 as well is that Guma, to me, has been a standout. Really have to mention his consistency and the amount of work he's able to do in... I'm going to shout at the late game team fights, because I feel like that's where it's the most important and where he has shown the most. But even the laning phase has been, I think, a pretty big step up. Although I still feel great about my Viper first after today's
I think the biggest thing that helped me realize that Guma is really stepping above and beyond now is the fact that in the past, I was always like, wow, Keria did this amazing thing, or Keria did that amazing thing in the laning phase and outside of it in terms of like helping Guma. But now it feels like Guma's kind of taking the reins.
Yeah.
You know, Keria is still playing Thresh, but he's not, you know, he's still making some cool plays and stuff, but he's not really the standout highlight guy. It's like, oh, it's Guma now, which is, in my mind, is just mind-boggling because in the past, however many years, whoever's playing with Keria, just because Keria is Keria, it's just really impressive to see that now Guma and, you know, Faker, I'd say, are now outshining Keria, which is crazy to me.
There's like a few moments in this meta now we've gotten to the point where like it is just, instead of like, okay, we have Lucian versus Azeri, so like there's one AD carry who's going to get some tempo, or Draven to get some tempo versus the scaling champ. Now we have a lot more like Zeri versus Xayah, or Aphelios versus Zeri, or Aphelios versus Xayah, handshaking in slow games. And in those moments, you actually have the power as an AD carry to make the clutch play and just instantly kill the other AD carry. And Guma has done that so many times. We'll just flash forward and make sure that AD carry can't pop off. Like, he'll kill the Zeri really quickly in a team fight. And sometimes he'll die for it, but often he'll live. But he's just super decisive. Like, he does not wait, and he will see blood in the water and absolutely take down the enemy AD carry super early. Almost playing these champs like they're assassins, and just do his burst, Gale Force in, kill somebody, and then he's like, fight's over. We won. I killed them. And everyone piles onto me, but it doesn't matter. Now we front to back, and the fight's over. That kind of play that we're seeing from him, his decisiveness and how quickly he reacts, is something that like I feel like no other AD carry is really doing that. I think Viper has a few times, but no one's doing it as consistently in team fights as Guma.
I think the player that used to do it really well was Ruler, actually. And unfortunately, we kind of lost him. We did lose him to LPL for now, but Guma's kind of fulfilling that role now as like the most clutch AD carry. So he's kind of like gotten his identity now on this roster of crazy beasts, which is really cool.
No, it's super sad. Vipers out.
I do want to mention, like, I think Guma is the player that I trust the most to play on-hit Varus as well. And that's actually, like, talking about Ruler. Ruler was the only other guy. Like,
Remember
watching Ruler, like, like
that
watching
one Ashe
Ruler
highlight. Oh my god!
Watching Ruler kite was like, I mean, that feels good. And the same can be said for some of the games that Gumayushi has been playing. He's just been absolutely amazing. And I think in their series against Gen G, he had to step up, right? Because Pays is super good, but Guma was just better.
He made the series kind of like about 80 carry gap, which is not always that common nowadays.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing. Anyway, we should probably move on because we will be talking about T1 again because we'll have to mention the Gen G series. But we'll mention another Gen G series first as they were able to take down Humble Life Esports. This series made me sad, guys.
Sad and frustrated.
Yeah.
And not happy.
No, because this was the series where we found out that Humble Life Esports aren't actually that good. And D+ just weren't that good.
So
on the day.
I do also think that Gen G have a really good matchup into Humble Life. Specifically because, and it's one of the reasons as well as we get into the Gen G versus KT discussion later, I think Gen G is extremely focused playing towards the bot side of the map. And I think that if Hanwha, their bot side falls behind, they don't play the game. Mm-hmm. So you have a mid lane matchup that is very obviously Chovy favored, especially with Zeka's form. But even outside of that, I feel like Chovy is still very dependable in lane. And then Peanut can just camp bot. And obviously Life was also not having the best play of his life. So I think that Gen G always will have a good matchup, but it also kind of cemented that Humble Life individually were not.
It was like a tier list gap.
Yeah.
And I think Gen G didn't even really have to show anything. I don't even think that's the best play we've seen out of Gen G. They were just like, let's see how much we could do with, like, how well we can play without showing anything and really, like, revealing our hands or our drafts or anything. That was just kind of like, we got the real matchup coming up against T1, so we'll just take this one pretty easy, pretty slow, and just, it was a tier list gap across the top side of the map. And I think that made the series pretty easy to play for Gen G, and like many of our 3-1s we've talked about so far, like all of them now, so far in our discussion about the bracket, it was kind of a series you don't really think about that much. It made Gen G look, fine, but you knew like they didn't really show their best. It made you worried about HLE because you're like, now you're in the losers bracket. You've got KT. If you beat KT, you probably have a rematch against Gen G. Like, it seemed pretty doomed for HLE after that series.
What I got from it was that HLE, you flip a coin on the day. And sometimes
But it's definitely
you see some gooder stuff, and sometimes you don't.
It's definitely a loaded coin, though.
Oh yeah,
as in it's not a 50-50.
It's weighted. Yeah. It's more weighted to tails. Just generally, but it's like if it does come up heads, then that team. I mean, if you've got Viper on your team, like the win conditions, like you have an advantage. It's It's just a bit sad that they're unable to.
It is because it's not that hard. You just have to not be actively a detriment to your team and play for Viper.
Don't let Viper carry.
Well, yeah, kind of, and that just didn't happen at all. And then, as mentioned, I think Gen G is very good at playing towards the bot side. They've been doing it for like 2 years, and they got a bot side downgrade, but still gets the job done.
Yeah, there is like the stylistic factor of the fact that they just play the same.
Yeah, they don't have to change their strategy at all.
No. And Doran and Kingen are kind of the same player.
Yeah, like bookmark this because this will be a conversation we have a little bit later on, actually.
Yeah, because I think it's a good lead into T1 Gen G because that series was a lot more interesting than this. Because this one kind of solidified what we already knew.
Yeah. So let's move on to where Gen G went after that, after beating HLE with a 3-1. They then face against T1 here. So this series, I was hoping for another really close one because we sort of saw this as a possible precursor for what the final is going to look like. And yes, I know T1 versus Gen G finals, the more things change, the more they stay the same. This time around, of course, T1 more looking like the favorites rather than last year where Gen G were coming in so hot.
Also, it's going to be KT, so it's okay.
Well, this is the thing.
We'll get to that in a minute.
I think going into this series, I think a lot of us, I know Mal, you and I, still think that Gen G probably the team to be going through. Although I'm not sure after that last series. But Gen G playing through the bottom side into T1 did not work one little bit. And I think what I found from this series, the T1 versus Gen G, is that T1's just the best team in the world. That's what I
think that the series before it, the Gen G versus Sama Life Esports one, really solidified that even though Gen G didn't have to show a lot, they also did show a lot of comfort of, okay, we're just going to put Pays on a hyper carry, and he's going to carry, and we can just play around him. So T1 were like, we're not going to let you get Zeri, first of all. I think they came in with a very solid plan. They just took Jace a lot as well, took it away, and played around the top side, and they got ahead of the bottom side because Pays wasn't on comfort, and it just ended up being much easier for T1, I think, in that facet because they actually did learn a decent amount from what Gen G had to show in the series against Sama Life. Even though it wasn't a lot, I think it was enough comfort that they showed. It felt like T1 came in very prepared, very respectful against Gen G, and they just kind of clapped them.
Yeah. I was worried after the T1 KT series that that T1 would have like kind of remember what happened to Sandbox where they beat Nongshim but they didn't really because they beat them, but then after that the descent started and they lost to Guangdong, and that team was never going to make a deep playoffs run, but I do think that really shook them. T1 did the opposite where they took that loss and like, okay, we'll clean it up, and then they look way better. They really took the experience of playing versus KT. I also think that Gen G, particularly the support and top gap, was very apparent. I think that Pays didn't look amazing, but I think his team fighting was still as good as it needed to be. I think Chovy played incredible. No notes on Chovy, really trying his darndest. But with both Doran and the Light underperforming, also playing versus Ace and Carrier, so like to what extent is it underperforming versus... It's also the Light hasn't really played a lot of playoffs, right? Like he made playoffs last year with Brewery on, and that was about it. So I think that also plays a small part. But that's not enough to win against T1. Everyone needs to be firing on all cylinders, and I don't really see that happening. Even if we do get a rematch of that in the finals.
Yeah.
When I was casting that series with Valdes, like the biggest standouts for me were, like before that series, I told everyone like, I don't know, I have this weird feeling like maybe Gen G could win. I think that feeling came from the fact that, as Chronicler said, that win against KT felt like it was really concerning. And I was like, before that series starts, we're either going to have a T1 that was just like, oh, it was an off day, don't worry, we'll just keep doing our thing. And I think that T1 loses to Gen G, or a T1 that goes, okay, this is actually where we hunker down, prepare really well, prepare some specific drafting for Gen G, respect this team a lot, and come into this best of 5 like it's the finals. And they did, and they won.
Yeah.
And things like Guma's play, like we talked about Guma stepping up big, and I think he did in that KT series. But I think he really stepped up in this Gen G series. Not that like it was required, but his positioning, his play, his Valdes, is just insane. Like you can't kill this guy, you can't find him, you can't get in the back line. His spacing is so good for these team fights. It's just crazy. The things that he did, like we're like, oh yeah, Pays, like maybe rookie of the year, like he's on track, like most kills of the rookie split, like this guy looks really good.
Definitely
Guma's like, what about the veteran?
Yeah, still.
Well, so far. There's still the rest of the year.
Guma just shows up, he's like, well, I'm the veteran actually now. Like I am way better than you. Like it's time to show who the master is, because his performance, like he gapped him pretty hard. It's not like Pays played badly, but Guma just played way better. It was insane. And when they just took Zera away from every time, it was very apparent that Gen G didn't have that much else in the tank in terms of drafting to beat T1 in later games.
Yeah, it was a little bit of a worry. I think that like what took away from Pays was Delight's underperformance. I actually thought that was a bit surprising. Delight was, because Delight to me was a player that even when he was on Brion was showing a lot of promise. Like this guy was laning with Henna and still looking good, which I think is pretty impressive given what Henna used to look.
Glow up Henna as well.
And the glow up only got them to like what 8th or 7th, right? So he looks better now, but there's still like that shows that for Delight to be seen as being a pretty good support, like that's a pretty big accolade. But yeah, this was not the series. We're going to need to see better from him if they're going to challenge KT in our lower bracket final, which is going to be an exciting one. Poor choice of words there, Atlus, but it's fine. I think that
You weren't referring to any team in particular.
No, I wasn't. I was just saying that life in general is just going to be exciting, and that's super cool. Now I'm completely lost and don't know where I am.
We're talking about T1 versus Gen G.
T1 versus Gen G, and the so Delight underperforming makes Pays look worse as well, because it means that like Delight's presence in lane hasn't been as good. Like their 2v2 just looked off. Like this is the team that like started the hit level 6 on Zeri Leona and just kill you.
Yeah, just
strategy. Like they did that like twice in a row. They made D+ look silly by doing it into them. So like we had a lot of high hopes, and I think that was the biggest disappointment for me in that series. And I think that took away from, because I think Wolf and I were a bit in agreement about maybe like Gen G could do it. But as soon as the bot lane situation happened, that was when it was difficult. And maybe it's just due to the fact that like Guma had stepped up so much in this series, because this is where like he had his on-hit Varus domination and was just like kiting everyone. Like you go back and watch those team fights, like he stacks his Rage Blade and just never stops autoing. It's insane.
Yeah,
like his movement's so good.
Lethal tempo is a
and
great range.
I think it's hard for Gen G when you can't play around the bot side, And I think T1 came into that. They did it in pick ban, and they also did it in the game in terms of like neutralizing Pays, shutting down Delight, making him not look good. And I'll be maybe not the first person to say it, but I think that owner is currently in much better form.
Talk about, damn it.
Much better form than
about
Peanut.
that.
Like Peanut is serviceable. I don't think he, sometimes Twitch chat likes to get excited, and he has had a couple of moments here and there, and he's good. But I think Owner is fantastic. So the way that Owner was able to, and it's not always fair because whenever you're talking about junglers, you do need to talk about the lanes that he does gank for and the ones that he plays around, and if they're drafting for prio in order to allow your jungler to do some of the stuff. And generally, I think T1, comes back to having that synergy, that camaraderie, the greatly prepared drafts and stuff to allow him to have as much success that he is having. So I think that was a big difference maker as well, even if it wasn't as apparent. I think we were talking a lot about some of the like individual performances of guys like Guma, stuff that was more surprising rather than like the consistent outplaying from Owner over Peanut in that series.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the point, right? Like, the only one who didn't do that well for T1 was Zeus, and that's just compared to his usual form. It's not like he was bad by any means. He was just not as good
Carrier
as
as well.
usual.
I actually think that we've been singing the praises of Zeus and Carrier. They have been clearly the best in their role all season long. but it's the other 3 in the playoffs that have been the standouts for T1. And it's just super cool for this team.
It's just not fair. It's also, and this is an issue we've seen with many of our teams, like when they're really on form. Like, how is Owner still continually able to get Sejuani? It's because you need to ban like 15 other things.
Yeah.
Right? Like that I think it just eventually reaches critical mass where like every lane's winning, and because of every lane winning, you get to do way more, and you get to, and T1 are just they're just so good, and this series kind of solidified. I don't expect that rematch. If it does end up coming, I don't expect it to look any different. I also don't think the KT-T1 match will look that different. Like, I'm actually of the belief that like those 2 series have kind of solidified for me that T1 is definitely winning the split.
Which would make an upset even that much more exciting.
It would.
Yay!
It would. Yeah.
I think it's actually really, really cool because now we have, I believe, we haven't spoken about the match that we had today.
Yeah.
You tried to sneak it past
I tried
us.
to get past it, didn't I? Well, KT won it. It was great. Cool. Okay. Moving on. No, I think we'll have to say goodbye to Humble Life Esports here. Do we have?
We do.
Is it dangerous?
We can say goodbye to Viper.
Oh, yeah, that's true. I mean, he was the only one that showed up, so we should probably just say goodbye to him because the others weren't here.
I mean, Clid really. I'll address it. You know,
Yeah,
I'll talk about it.
The elephant is looming.
Clid had, I think, some really high highs this season, right? Like,
even in the series, he wasn't the liability.
His first
for most
2 games were great.
Yeah.
The Clid-demption thing, like that, I guess I kind of willed into existence. Felt really nice when we were like cresting the end of the first round robin and being like, all right, well, some huge improvement has been made. This guy looks really good. And then at the end of the season, it was a little bit more hit and miss. But in that final game, he was not there. Like he really made some critical errors before objectives, ulting into BDD to essentially. I have no idea what he was trying to do there. Like, we were talking about it, like, because I wasn't working this show day, but I was with Huni and crew, and we were like, maybe he was thinking that, like, he could actually turn this fight around that way, and, like, maybe there's a follow-up, but he died there before the soul fight. He died before Elder by himself, like, and it was
Vault breaking over that wall with no flash blew my mind.
Yeah,
that
one
know.
I have no idea. So the first one, actually, when I looked at the replay, I think maybe the idea was so he ults in, right? Because I thought at first he wanted to try and get through the case. That wasn't the case. So maybe the plan was he ults in with Zillion ult on top of him, and Viper tried to follow. So maybe Viper also goes over the wall, but Viper got caught on like the last 0.2 seconds of a cage.
It's tricky,
That's
cage.
Yeah,
it lasts
that's,
for longer than you
yeah.
think.
Well, I mean,
it's like 8 seconds.
Yeah.
It's
So
ridiculous.
like and that's like the other play I have no idea, and I'm not trying to make, but that's like, maybe that was it. That doesn't really excuse it, and it doesn't really address the other issue.
So what I was gonna say is like that now we've addressed that.
Yeah.
That was not really the main issue in this series.
It was not good ramp up, Wolf.
It's the one that people will talk about because it's the one that happened at the end, and it was the most egregious thing that happened. It was like when Peanut.
It was the most obvious one.
Yeah, exactly.
When
The
Peanut made that
the
mistake against Kwangdong, and everyone's like, "Well, that was Peanut lost them the series." I'm like, "Yeah, but there were some other serious issues in that best of 3, right?"
It got to game 3 in the first place.
There were problems with Hanwha Life's team fighting. There were problems with the lane setups. There were problems with Zeka. And Zeka really had a very weak series. And, like, we went from, okay, he's not going to control mages, but it's okay if he's on, like, assassins that are AP and melee champions. And now I'm like, so the AP assassins were not good with that one either. It's just only the melee champions. Oh, the melee champion's not getting lane pro. He's not having control. He's not skirmish well. The melee's like, we're running out of things. It was not a great series for him, which is really sad because usually it's he and Kingen who pop off and show up in really high pressure situations. This is the highest pressure situation they've been in since they beat D+. Like, you lose this, you're out. And they were practically invisible. It was only Viper doing anything at any point in time.
Yeah, I felt pretty bad for Zeka because he was getting a lot of blame, and for a good reason. He didn't have a great series. But you are playing into BDD that's on 100% form. He's also playing probably his best champion right now, which is Veigar. And you're not supposed to die to Veigar the way that he did, but I think that once he started getting bodied, I think mentally he was just out of it. And like they're like, okay, we're going to put you onto comfort. Let's give you Yone. And then he gets spanked even harder on Yone, and it's like, well, now I can't even play like my best champ maybe. So what does he do? He plays Tristana blind, and it works.
He got Prio.
Yeah.
That's
It
all.
works.
That's all Viper
Like,
needed was a little bit of mid
I
Prio.
push lane, and I try to ignore my opponents, and maybe I'll survive. So maybe is that like the next step after giving you pure comfort? And I think it was just too much. And then you get to game 4, and it's like, well, other things were going on. So
There was
what
a
can you
Reddit
say? I felt
comment.
pretty bad for him.
Yeah, there was a Reddit comment that really solidified. I was like, man, bold choice to make Zeka play Malphite.
In the Tristana game.
Yeah.
That was actually very, very good.
But I'm glad you highlighted Valdes, because I do think that obviously like it was a bad series, but it's also important to remember that you're in an extremely high stakes situation, and your first game, like you make like 2 mistakes in lane, and against a player as good as BDD, that just means that
And then the one where he
the game's done.
distorted into the cage
Yeah.
that was
Yeah.
forming, like you can see that.
Yeah.
He's just like, I'm gonna go and look for poke, and then he just dies though.
He was 0-4 on LeBlanc
that
game.
would
That's so
tilt
rare.
me so
Yeah.
much. If I did that in a solo queue game that was close and like in my promos, imagine, and then this guy's playing in like his last big playoff match that is going to
Yeah.
either kick him out, and he's got this much pressure. Like imagine that.
Yeah, normally you can
I'd be
like
so out
step
of it.
away from your computer after that.
Yeah.
You're like, well,
No,
I'm
he
definitely
can't.
going to lose
That's
my
game
next,
one.
my next promo game, so I'm going to step away. You're not allowed to do that if you're in Zeka's
And he has
position.
not been upset by like losses like this really ever in important best of 5s across his career. This is one of those first series where you're like, is he tilted or is BDD just that good? And I'm kind of leaning towards BDD is just that good, right, in a lot of ways. Because like the Yone game, he wasn't going to get lane prio, but the rest of the game was kind of falling apart around him. Obviously, the LeBlanc game, some small mistakes into Veigar. The Veigar really messed up the entire team comp there for HLE. I think BDD is insane right now. I agree. I think he might be the best lane mid laner we have in the LCK. I think he's better than Chovy. I'm going to say the crazy thing. I think his
Not on
laning
board.
and his prio setups are better than Chovy's right now. And he outplayed Chovy last time they met up against each other in the lane. His Veigar is crazy. He's going to get prio with Talia. He's just going to play.
Please no more Talia.
I mean, he will get lane prio with it, okay? Like, he will get lane prio with
will.
it, as you often do.
But please, no.
But
Yeah, don't play that
maybe
game.
he shouldn't play it in the next series, but BD's insane right now, his form. It's crazy. And so, like, we could forgive some of Zeka's play because he's playing against, in my opinion, the best early game mid player we have in the LCK right now.
Yeah.
That's like part of the overarching feeling of like, let's give this guy a little bit of credit because he is going into maybe one of the best mid laners in the world right now, and he had a really rough game 1. So like,
Yeah.
whether it's nerves, whether it's tilt, whether it's just playing against a really awesome guy, like I find it hard to blame him specifically.
And it's also coming off that Gragas game as well in the series
Which was
beforehand,
also
which
very
was
sad.
just probably the worst Gragas performance that we've seen in the LCK. It was just not good.
It was like
In any way.
6,000 damage or something, maybe even less.
Yeah.
It was a rough one, yeah.
And like
Yeah.
that one play, like that was where like Zeka mental boomed, was that one play over the Raptor wall. Like we saw
one.
his mental explode.
yeah.
Oh, don't remind me about that one. I forgot about that.
So
Yeah.
on the flip side, on the plus side, to send them off happily, Viper's
go.
obviously amazing.
He's super good, yeah.
Yeah, Viper, we talked about him so much today as well because it was like kind of the only thing to talk about positive for him, but also because he was just that good, like taking single-handedly control of a lot of the games, even though it wasn't enough. And I actually do think we saw good King in here today. I actually think he did show up. Obviously, when he got blind picked and Keen kind of keened on him, I think you can't hold it against anyone because even Zeus, right? Like that's how good he is right
Keen's
now.
gonna keen, you know?
Yeah.
You can't have it.
The top, of course, the top rise Gragas counter pick comes out and completely dunks on you. But I do think that King N is like a player that after that series, I'm like, if Hanwha become good down the line, like he is going to do exactly what he did today, which is just be a great frontliner, right? Like his Ornn, his Gragas as well. It's what he does. I think he will keep doing that well. But yeah, Klid, Life, and Zeka.
We wanted one of KT or Harmer Life Esports to be good. And thankfully one of them is. Because these were like
Got one.
Yeah, right? But like these were the two teams where it's like, oh, this combination of players could be good. Didn't know, you know? Like We didn't know whether they'd actually like figure themselves out, but KT absolutely has. And that is going to segue beautifully into talking about what has not yet happened. And that is Gen.G versus KT. The more I've sat here, right? Like I have already predicted that I expect Gen.G to be the better team. The more I sit here, the more we talk about it, I'm like, it's impossible for Gen.G to win this series. What?
Really?
Like, yeah.
No.
Seriously.
So, all right. So I've been on the KT push for finals for a while, right? Like, I didn't think that it was going to happen necessarily the way it's happened, but I was like, oh, it could happen, right? Like, after the T1 KT series, I'm like, all right, I've been predicting like 3-0s for KT. I've been pushing hard because I think this team has a really high ceiling and they play very well. So the reason why I think they'll beat Gen.G actually is because remember going back to the Gen.G HLE series, we're like, oh, I just got tier list diffed, right? On basically all the lanes except bot. And so you can't carry with a Viper alone when Pays is almost as good. Now, this time, we have a much bigger gap between Pays and aiming. I think Pays is way better than aiming. But the further we go up the rift, I'm like, okay, well, I think BD is better than Chovy. I think that's probably the most controversial thing I'm going to say. I think he's better than Chovy right now in the early game. I think Cuz is better than Peanut. And I think 100% Keen is better than Doran. And I look at this and I go, what has KT been doing in all of their games? Getting lane prio. BD always has lane prio. Keen always has lane prio. Aiming, he's scaling. It's okay.
He gets lane prio with Veigar, which is not supposed to happen.
It's not supposed to happen, but he's making it happen. And then you have Cuz, who then has insane power around the map because they always have mid prio. They usually have top prio. And I'm like, is Peanut going to be able to solve this? Peanut usually has a lot more agency in these games. His pathing is incredible. He punishes a lot of top laners. Like, Peanut plays around topside more than most junglers because he's like, I got Doran up here. Doran's going to pull him towards the turret. I'm going to punish. I'm going to make a sick play. I'm going to path in a way they can't see me. I don't think you'll do that against Cuz. I don't think you're going to find that angle. And the more I think about it, I'm like, yeah, unless we go to late game where every time Pays is just comfortably sitting on like 2 kills and he's got 3 items, 4 items, you get to 35 minutes plus, like, I think KT's team fighting is great too. Maybe they have an edge, Gen.G do, because I think Pays is better. But in terms of how the early to mid goes, I don't see Gen.G getting leads in any of these games unless Pays is on Zeri. And I think Zeri will not be played a single game in this best of 5 because we'll be banned every single game.
My thing is I keep going back to the Gen.G KT series that we saw. And like KT's dissection of everything that Gen.G wanted to do in that series was just gorgeous. Like, the
Twisted
way
Fate games,
the Twisted Fate into a Kali situation, which will not be repeated necessarily. Like, that was a gorgeous use of the map to play against exactly what Gen.G wants to do. And I think after today's series against Hammerlife Esports, I don't think that aiming is necessarily. I don't think he's as good as Pays. I think Pays is performing better, but I also think that it doesn't matter because I think that KT are really good at saying that they don't really care that much about the bottom lane and they win through topside and through Cuz being able to just find the angles that he needs to in order to get them the early game that they need. And I just think that Keen is so much better than Doran. The more I think about it, the more I think that top lane is actually... It has developed across this season to be a much more pivotal role for the winning of a game than it was at the beginning. Remember at the beginning where like, well, top lane, completely irrelevant. They come into the game at 20 minutes and they hope their team hasn't entered the game away. But now I feel like there is so much more to being a top laner. And I also thought that Doran was pretty good at nullifying. But now I also think that that doesn't matter because Keen started playing tanks and started playing tanks well. So now I'm like, well, it's...
Keen can play anything. That's a scary thing. Doran's champion pool used to be like quite wide, I felt like, in the past, where you'd be like, oh, okay, like it's an Aatrox game for Doran. You're like, this doesn't necessarily make sense, but Doran will make it work here. But a lot of the champions that Doran has like in his back pocket aren't really relevant right now. So, like, is he going to play Akshan in this best of 5? Don't think so. Hope not. But
I hope not.
You know what I mean? I just feel like Keen
Maybe
has
game
the
3.
widest champion pool out of any player in the LCK right now. Like, Zeus, maybe he has more that he hasn't shown because he's been just playing like blind Gnar every game. But I think Keen has proven this guy's got champion ocean.
Yeah.
We should let the Gen.G believers talk.
now we should
I'm not
do
going
it.
to speak before Mao does.
Are you? Why? No.
No, because otherwise it's going to be the three of us kind of. I'm more in the middle.
I don't mind.
I'm kind of... Well, no, I want you to speak.
Okay, then I'll speak first. So there's a couple of things. First and foremost, top lane is doomed. Do agree with that one. There's no salvage in that. Yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna argue that. I do think that Doran had a bad series, and against T1. I don't think it'll be that bad, but I do think that Keen will be better. But I also think that actually we saw today that I think KT look their best when they are playing with Keen on a carry. And I don't think that they're going to do that every single draft, because we saw today as well. Like, I think in tank versus tank matchups, the gap will not matter, because I do think Doran will do a good job in that case. And it will require a shift from Gen G, because they've been extremely proactive with just R4ing Gnar or Cassante or Renekton for Doran. But if they pivot away from that and they're willing to expand the draft resources, I think the Keen issue can be mitigated. Not solved, but mitigated, because we will see that generally... KT will then pick Sion or pick Malphite and pick something where there is space available. Then the jungle matchup, I actually do agree. I think Cuz, I've been singing the praises of Cuz. I think that he is better than Peanut. But I do think that I still prefer the 2v2 of Chovy and Peanut over Cuz and BDD. And that's, I think, really the crux, is I think that Chovy's series against T1 was incredibly good. And I still think that Chovy is, bar faker, the most reliable player that you can have to ensure that you don't always lose mid lane prio. I don't think BDD will get mid lane prio with Veigar or Taliyah into Chovy. I don't see that happening. And I do think that taking that into account... KT's bot lane, I think, really struggled today. And obviously it's into Viper, but it's Viper, it's the 3v3 to me that matters, right? And it's Viper, and Viper is amazing, but Cuz and Clit and Life are not. And still, we saw that KT really struggled. And it's partially because they play into it, because Lahans roams a lot, right? But I think that Gen G have, to me, I have the confidence in Gen G to, through mid and jungle, be able to punish it when KT is going to overinvest on the other side of the map. And I think if Gen G is able to get Pace in a leading position, that KT will have a really hard time. And I expect Gen G to be able to do that, but the crux is mid, because if you do think BDD is better, which I think is a fair thing to say...
I think I should quantify it saying that I think BDD's laning is better. I think Chovy has been more clutch in team fights. I think Chovy has been like Faker. I think the comparison you made earlier, like what he's going to do for you in a late game team fight, has been slightly more reliable. I wouldn't say massively more reliable, but more reliable than BDD in the late game.
And if you haven't been following, it's so funny that you say that. I'm sorry to interrupt, but like, just to highlight the fact that we're talking about BDD being a better laner than Chovy, when all we've said for 3 years is that Chovy is the best laner in the world.
I think he still can be, but he just chooses not to be. Because I think that he is clearly shifting his playstyle. And I think that the game that him and... I don't remember which series it was, but him and Peanut on Vi and Ahri, where they just completely ran the map. I think it was the Humble Life series, but I'm not 100% sure. It was also against Zeka, so that'll be a lot easier. But the crux for me is that if you trust in BDD, I think that KT is the only prediction that makes sense, because if you don't admit prio, Pace and Delight are not going to be able to bully aiming and lands enough, even though I think aiming is like the clear weak point. I don't think Delight and Pace are like going to be able to do that in the 2v2. And then like topside, as mentioned, I think you're going to definitely lose. So you need to win bot. And if Chovy wins, which I expect will happen, then I expect Gen G to pull out ahead.
Yeah. I think we need to see Delight step up.
Sure, yeah. I mean, Doran also can't play as poorly, but the same for aiming, right? Like aiming,
I think aiming can play the same way. I think aiming had like... He had some moments, but he also
Zeka
was
isn't
kind of fine.
Like, if you give Pace a couple of kills like Viper got in this game, like, BDD isn't going to run over Chovy by any means. So then the fat 80 carry will have a mid laner.
I have a lot to say about aiming, but I want Valdes to talk first, because I feel like we're all just kind of like waiting to hear what he has to say.
I was just gathering information like a sponge.
Yeah,
sponge. I take a lot from how these two teams played against T1, because honestly, like, if you're just kind of beating Humble Life Esports, which both of these teams, Gen G and KT, are much better than Humble Life Esports in my mind, and I think you'll take liberties in draft, even if you're not noticing it, which I totally agree. I think like BDD's not really going to just be able to blind Veigar or just like play it into anything and just get away with it. Gen G and Chovy and Peanut should be able to punish that a lot more. So One thing I will say, though, is that I think KT handled the stress of the situation as a team, and also the understanding and like the preparation for a big match like T1 a lot better than I think Gen G did against T1. Maybe T1 was the better team against Gen G. That's also possible, but I was just really impressed that KT almost took it over the line, and they almost won a best of 5. Like, they were ahead in game 5 against T1. So in my mind, like, everything they were doing in the drafts and like their confidence, and even under so much pressure, they were still nearly able to take a best of 5 against T1 is a really good sign. You guys have covered a lot of like the individual stuff in terms of the lanes, and so I'm not going to get too much into it, but I will say that Pays and Delight, they struggled against T1 in the first match. They struggled against T1 in this playoff match as well, like going from beginning of spring all the way to now. And it doesn't get any easier. Like, maybe you can say, oh, they're not going to be as nervous against like Aiming and Lehens, but I would just say that I think when it comes to a finals that's also going to be on stage in Jamshir in a massive stadium, I think the guys on KT will just be able to handle that pressure a lot more than Pays and Delight, and even Peanut. Like, it's weird to say, but I don't know, to me, like, Cuz has only been thriving under the pressure of, some of these big matches compared to Peanut, who's kind of been throwing under the pressure of these big matches, or in pressure situations in big games against Guangdong Freaks. So when it comes to the straight-up 5v5, and as the two teams going head-to-head, like, I have a lot more faith that KT will handle the pressure, and I think they're just better at preparing for some of these series. Like, I think that they can have Keen carrying the top side, they can have BDD carrying the mid lane, but also I think, Aiming's going to come in very prepared alongside Lehens for the bottom lane, and they can kind of neutralize Pays and Delight. At the same time, Pays and Delight, maybe they kind of take from this series against Hamalei Feast or against T1, and they're like, we gotta support these guys better. We gotta find like a new way to draft for Pays, because, like I said earlier, like Gen G, they revealed a lot. They're like, we're just gonna pick Zeri, and Pays is
not
gonna
play
get a
Zeri
comfort.
this series.
Yeah, he's not gonna get to play Zeri. So I think they have to come in here with a new strategy and take down KT. So all these things, like, I'm kind of middling, because I do agree, like, Chovy and Peanut might just be able to step up and 2v2 and outplay them. But I am leaning KT slightly. So I'm probably going to go for, like, 3-2 in my prediction.
I really like the point you made about the preparation for both of these teams in the bottom lane, because I think there's 3 picks for these 2 players. 2 picks for Aiming, 1 pick for Pays that we haven't seen in playoffs at all, that are kind of like their specialty picks. For Aiming, it's the Ezreal, right? First of all, and the Kai'Sa. These are 2 picks I think could come out in this best of 5 if they prepare a dive comp for the Kai'Sa pick for Aiming. He is insane on this pick, because I think people kind of forgot, just because the meta has been so far away from that for so long, that it's like, oh, he just scales. Like, that's what he does. Like, he's like a worse version of Viper. He's a worse version of Pays. But he can pull out the Kai'Sa, and if KT start drafting like that and get into Gen G's heads, like, that's a huge angle. Like, Lehens loves playing with Kai'Sa in the lane. Like, he played with Ruler, right? He's going to love it. So I think that's something that could come out in the series that KT might be hiding. The Ezreal, we saw so many Ezreal Karma lanes for KT in the early part of the season. There's been some significant nerfs to Karma, so maybe we won't see that necessarily, that combo. But I think Aiming's Ezreal is super strong, because this is a meta where you got to avoid, like, Malphite ults and stuff like that. And I think he's being a super mobile AD carry could be a huge thing that they pull out in this series. And then for Pays, I think there's some dive comps that they could play with his Jhin. I actually would not be surprised if Pays actually plays Jhin in this best of 5. These are the series that you're going to go down to the wire in, as both of these teams, and you will be tested in your champion pool, the 80 carries in particular, because that's where all the bans are going right now. No Varus, no Lucian, no Zeri. These are taken away every time. Draven, I think, likely to be banned. I don't want to see Aiming play Draven. I think that's not his strong suit. I think that's not a pick that he's really going to excel on. But I really think that if you have a kind of trick up your sleeve here, this is where you're going to be forced to show it. And unfortunately, T1 is watching, right? So
I don't even want to see either of these players play Lucian. They both kind of suck.
yeah,
Just let it go.
Especially Aiming, Matt. I really don't.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think they both should just shy away from. I think that's okay.
We're just seeing a lot of weirdness in the bottom lane of, like, everything's getting choked out,
We
like
had
you said.
Ziggs
So
as
it's
well.
like I guess we just have to play Zyra Khan every game.
And Aphelios maybe like is a huge thing too.
Aphelios Thresh, I mean,
Do you think they'll
maybe
ban Aphelios into pace?
Yeah.
I think he'll mostly play Zaya.
and it really like stretches you down to like 1 or 2 picks. Like Wolf was saying, like maybe they are forced to pick something like that because they just don't get to play Zaya, or like maybe a Rakan ban comes out on blue, and then it's like, what are you gonna do now? You know, you can't play Zaya Rakan. We're gonna first pick Zeri if it's open. Not saying it will be, but maybe like Varus is left open instead.
Callista Renato lane happens.
What are you gonna do? Like, and so the meta is gonna be very interesting. I think that Aiming and Lehens are they don't necessarily have champion oceans, although Lehens plays Blitzcrank. But I think they are more experienced and they have ways to like play through that and not get too pressured by it or too stressed by it. Like, what if the coach is like, all right, Paze, you got to pull out your Jhin for this game, or like you got to pull out your Kai'Sa. Like, I hope you can play Kai'Sa. Are they going to be able to handle that? I don't know. I also think that Genji have been getting Delight his Rakan, and every single time it comes out, we're like, he's on his Rakan. It's his best pick. He's so good at this. And these are like the things we say as casters because they are true. But then over the last like 2, 3, 4 times he's played it, it's like,
No.
well, this was supposed to be his best pick. So what's going on with this guy? So
Off day, maybe.
I don't know.
But
I actually
Maybe.
think that the Delight is, as I mentioned before, I think Pace, from what I've seen thus far, I do think he has some stress, but it does feel like he's mostly impervious. And I think Delight, that's just not the case at all. Delight looks like, I think Pace, there's moments where like, oh, you can see he's nervous, but for Delight, it's like, oh, you're really
Yeah, like for
struggling
Paze
with the
right before he has
pressure.
to do the interview, you're like, oh man.
I don't want to win. I might have to go on stage.
That's the real reason. But they would
The real
never
battle.
tell you.
That's actually
I
the only
lost
time
because
he
I
gets
was too
nervous.
stressed about the interview. I hinted. No, I'm sorry, guys. I'm going to be honest.
We lost because I wanted to throw so I didn't get POG, but I only wanted to throw a little bit so we could still win the game. Yeah.
That's why I died in mid. That's why I was backing there. Just didn't want to get POG.
How about this for a theory? And I think the bottom lane is going to be really pivotal, but I don't think that that's where the game's going to be decided. I kind of feel like if Wolf's theory about BDD being better than Chovy is true, I think that decides it.
Yeah, of course.
I feel like it's just mid lane. Like, if BDD can command how the lane goes, then I think that KT just win.
Yeah.
And if Chovy just is Chovy, and we've seen like things that Chovy has done to BDD in the past that have not been very nice. Like, if that comes back and happens again,
wasn't it that game where Chovy
the
played
Yone
Yone?
syndrome. Yeah, that was that was the biggest clapping we
I
have
don't think that's
ever
going to
witnessed.
happen.
But
though.
think
I
about
don't think that will ever happen.
Think
Yeah.
about all the times that BD has beaten Chovy in these important series, though, in playoffs across time. Like, this is one of the strongest rosters that Chovy's ever been on, right? Obviously, so there's a bit of a difference there. But, like, BD, I'd love to actually see the official number, and we definitely will when we talk about this matchup. But I feel like BD definitely has the winning record and has a lot of experience playing against Chovy in these best of fives. The storyline for the mid matchup is super sick because it's also BDD's old team that he's playing against. We could skip the little Nongshim part that happened in between, but I mean there is a lot going on in this series. I think it is definitely going to be a close one. I think it's going to be super sick. One of the things I want to talk about outside of the game itself is that when Valdes and I cast the T1 Telecom War for the upper bracket part where T1 picked KT.
Yep, round 2.
The crowd was overwhelmingly T1. But I felt like the KT part, which may be like 20-25%, because obviously there's just so many T1 fans, hard to get tickets. But that KT part of the crowd felt like it was deafening when they were hyped for the wins, because it has just been so long since this team has been to a finals venue. I think the KT fans are going to show up big, and they are going to be extremely happy to cheer for their team in a huge venue like this. And if the crowd goes against Genji here as well, because all these KT fans are like showing up for the first time in 5 years since I've been able to go to this really incredible match, I can get into your head a little bit. It feels like for KT, there's almost nothing to lose. This is like their best performance in so long. Whereas for Genji, you're like, oh, we better win this. Like, we better go to the finals. Like, everyone's expecting us to go to this finals. I think overall people are expecting Genji to win, even if we've kind of, as a casting team, overall leaned slightly to KT here. I think there's so much more to lose and so much more fear and stress and pressure on Genji than there is on KT.
I'm really worried. It's just I want this to be a really good series, but like now that you're saying, I'm like, what if it's just a 3-0 either way? Like,
yeah.
it's just it's like one of the,
no, that
No, don't
it's
say
like
it.
no, but
the finals.
we need to,
The finals more interesting,
no,
right?
finals also 3-0. So I actually
If
wanna,
this is a 3-0, I think the finals is 3-0.
Doesn't matter who makes it. Like I think the semis might be. I really hope that neither, because that's what I'm not saying it's going to happen, because I think that actually after last year, Gen G does earn some does deserve some faith, right? Like they were at in summer finals, they completely boomed T1, and that was with a meta that worked very well for them, which helped them out
and
a lot.
with the ruler.
And ruler in the hands.
And
yeah,
the hands, yeah.
Sure, but but like, and it might be a Payson like I mentioned, booming, but the top side I think will not collapse. Well, you know what? Let's skip past it. But
Chovy won't collapse. Yeah,
Chovy
that's
won't
what you
collapse.
meant.
There
That's
you
what
go.
you meant.
Thank
Yeah,
you. But more importantly, I really hope that it's not a 3-0, because if either, it will be so unsatisfactory. I feel like for
yeah.
either. If it's KT that 3-0s, I'd be okay with it, because it'd be a really new, cool storyline. But I hope that doesn't happen.
I don't think it's going to be a 3-0.
I don't think it's going to be a 3-0 either, but it could be, and that scares
It's going
me.
to be really close.
You know what's interesting thinking about this too? Like, the more I think about it, the more I'm like, I can't vote for Gen G here. Like, there's just too many variables that like go KT's way. We have seen Doran choke in these important series too many times, and I can't think of a time I've seen Keen choke ever, like ever. Now, last year he overall, like, if he's actually just kind of like mediocre, like it was last year, like if he plays mediocrely, is that a choke?
Over his career, Keen has just had some moments.
But has he had the moments that Doran has had, like in terms of chokes and big important moments?
This year, Keen hasn't had that, but like there were even some times like Keen would just have that, like, the brain fade where he's like, oh, I shouldn't be here, and dies, and like that, the game's over. Like, he has had those, less this year, but I don't think that we can say that Keen hasn't had the
Camille, the Camille game that we all remember, like that was one that, like,
The hook shot.
Incident. We've talked about it right here at this table, like at extensive length, but maybe I just have some sort of like weird bias around the fact that when Doran choked, it was like so imprinted in my memory, like how like he lost a game and then the rest of the series was like not actually in the game, like he was gone. It felt like, and I have not had the same feelings about Keen. Obviously, Keen has been on Afrika for so long that like Afrika wasn't playing these like really big series. They weren't going to semifinals, so maybe that's why it stands out to me more, because the moments where Doran did fall off were in these incredible moments in front of a giant crowd and everything is super high pressure.
Yeah, I think there's actually something to that, though, because the feeling that I get isn't necessarily like a faith in whether a player is going to throw or not, but I think that Keen can make a winning situation himself, and I don't think Doran can. I think Doran needs the team to be there to do anything.
But that's his job in the team as well. Like, the teams function completely differently, because Doran doesn't like.
But I think like winning your lane is something that should be celebrated, right? And I think that's something that Keen does and Doran doesn't do.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I'd say, like, if we were talking like rock, paper, scissors, I feel like Doran is rock and Keen is scissors, right? But Keen is also like a rock-shaped scissors now because he can play tanks really well. And so, like, if actually Doran was playing at his peak and Keen was like 2022 Keen, I'd be like, oh, this is a terrible matchup for Keen. Like, he can't break through Doran, and Doran plays super well defensively, and he's going to actually be able to play, just sit up there, play Malphite, sit up there and play Scion, sit up there and play Ornn. Doesn't matter, tank Gragas, and like Keen won't be able to break through that, and this is really bad for KT. But now that we know Keen has, first of all, punished tanks incredibly well, but also can play tanks himself, that's the extra angle.
Gwen game today, where he got a counter matchup and then just kind of
the scissors angle, yeah.
That was the.
God, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Walk right into that.
Well, it's
one.
actually just Malphite and Gwen at the same time. Like, that's what he is. He's not like he's Malphite holding Gwen's weapon. I don't know how to do this.
I think the more we go down to it, it actually is just like, which mid laner do you think is better? Because
seriously, right?
It actually just is, because it's I'm also thinking, if KT get Keen a counter matchup that's draft resources that BDD doesn't get. So then, can Chovy punish that? Yes or no? That depends on, right, like how good the players are.
Gen G will have side selection.
Yeah, they'll start blue.
Just want to get that out there.
Yeah.
So they'll have that extra time on.
So that's a great game. That's good for a 5-gamer, because I think if Gen.G win game 1, we can go to 5.
I think
if
that
they lose
KT
game
have
1,
had a lot of answers for red side more than any other team, and I think their extremely strong solo laners are the reason, alongside of their great drafting. But I think the great drafting also comes from the ability of these players to play those champions.
Yeah, of course.
A lot of times, like, players are like, no, I'm just going to play Cassante. Sorry. Like, this is going to be what I play. So we don't call it great drafting, right? Because it's just, we see the same guy playing Cassante or something basic all the time, whereas Keen is like actively counterpicking and punishing, which is not what a lot of players can do. And I think that BDD can do it, but won't do it as much. And I think that is a good angle if you are a Gen.G fan, or if you are a guy who thinks Gen.G is going to win. All the times KT are on red side, it's going to be much more difficult to take advantage of Gen.G compared to a team like Home Life Esports, right? Because the solo lanes in mid specifically will match up much more closely. Like, you're not just going to be able to play Veigar or like Ari into Yone and just get like a couple of ganks and totally boom him. Like, maybe Tovi plays Yone and he booms you somehow. Like, that could happen. Or Peanut comes in with the Vi, and then there's like some angles there. So there's going to be a lot of very interesting draft points for KT specifically, where they're like, do we get the counter matchup for Keen, or is he just playing Malphite this time? Do we have to put him on the tank because we need counterpick for BDD to play well into Chovy?
I think Gen.G's drafting overall has been way better than KT's all year. Like, I think that is not a strong point for KT, but they're still winning even with poor drafting, oftentimes, I think, for KT. Because they just draft around Prio, we're like, oh, are they going to team fight well? Who knows? This draft has serious holes in it, right? Where we're like, okay, can aiming even get to the point where you could survive here? Because you drafted 2 losing lanes in the early part of the season. Now they're drafting a lot for Prio, but like, do they scale well? Like, what's going to happen with this comp? It doesn't work together that well. But I also think that their adaptation in best of threes, in particular, like best of fives, we've seen some adaptation in this playoffs, but in best of threes, KT's adaptation wasn't as good as Gen.G's, but they just won anyways against Gen.G both times. So I think if the drafting for KT, if they fall into a trap or they can't adapt, like, that's one way Gen.G just wins outright, I think, potentially in the series.
I think it's really interesting, because I think you're right that the majority of the time Gen.G does draft a bit better than KT, but KT have had probably the best drafts. Like, my favorite drafts.
The less consistent, but the higher highs.
Yeah. It's like
I feel
they
that
sort of flatline down here, but like sometimes you get Twisted Fate.
Yeah, the
like,
Twisted
the Twisted Fate into Akali complete demolition of Gen.G is like so stuck in my brain, and I think that's like causing a bit of the same.
Sure,
bias,
no,
Wolf.
I think
like,
you're right though. I think
for
you're
me,
right.
like
There's some of the best drafting at like these weird specific niche picks, because both their soul laners have champion oceans where Kane's like, I'm playing Urgot, that's the angle, and they're like, okay, and they trust him and he does it.
It's the Rise pick today was like, that's another one of those highs, right? Like, really smart, identifying exactly what they could have done better. Like, they win game 1, but they're like, how do we win it gooder in game 2? And then they do it by identifying exactly like what they needed extra, and like, that's beautiful.
It's so interesting because there's also the Kassadin blind, which I haven't done in a long time, right? But like, that's why I think you're saying what you're saying. There's also those moments where like, at the same time though, if
aiming on Lucian repeatedly when he has not been doing well and stuff like this, where I'm like,
if we get out of draft and KT have a like GX TF Kai'Sa composition, like, I think they win 100% of the time, because I do think that they're like very similar to what RNG used to be very good at, not anymore because they lost Xiaohu, which, yay, maybe we can win MSI now. Which is kind of throwing off teams that I do think Gen.G is a team that will generally rely on team fighting by catching the mid-rotation, like setting up really good flanks and backline dives and whatnot. But barring those specific situations, the only lane that matters is mid lane. Like, I'm just
comes back.
I keep going back to it because you know how you win bot lane as well, which is like, I think, a really big loss condition for KT, because that is when they've looked bad. It's when aiming dies like 3 times in lane and the enemy AD carry like pops off.
And it's usually like duo kills where he just like dies.
Oh randomly. And that's where like a lot of the KT games where like the top half can't, and it's not really fair because aiming also gets very few resources with the roaming, but like, let's say bot lane loses so hard that top lane or top side can't carry. That's like a big loss condition. But also Gen.G I don't think is ever going to win through top, so they also need to win bot lane, And to do that, they need so it's just mid lane. And you know what? Cuz his aggressive style, invading a lot. You know how you do that? Mid lane priority. You know what? Peanut can dive people. You know what he needs for that? Mid lane prio. It's just mid lane.
Well, that means that it has to be drafted around as well, because it's not necessarily like the best player gets prio. It's the picks that dictate it a lot of the time.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I do think both of these teams have very distinct draft styles.
Yeah.
Like Gen.G drafting for a lot of CC, a lot of team fighting and scaling AD carries, whereas KT just lane prio, like try to get ahead.
That's what they do. They
and then go through that. But when it comes to like the head-to-head, KT have shown they have a lot more, like, as Hooney calls them, joker picks, like pocket picks, right? Where they are going to play the TF, they are going to play the Rise. And I think Gen.G's style is a little bit more figured out, right? It's a little, like, maybe 1 week more outdated. Not to say that, like, drafting for prio is a new idea. I'm just trying to say, like, in terms of the exact champions that they're picking, like, okay, well, we play Cassante and Zeri every game. That's what Gen.G were doing like 2-3 weeks ago as well, whereas KT are like, okay, now you have to think about Rise. Now you have to think about Urgot. Now you have to think about BDD just playing Veigar because he can against anything. That's not supposed to be okay. So I think there are a lot more wild cards in these drafts for KT because of the way their drafting styles match up.
And do you know what I've decided? I've decided that I almost don't mind. I think it's more interesting to have a new finals.
Yeah.
T1 versus KT, I think, is more fun because it's new. But if we send T1 and Gen.G to MSI,
awesome.
Psyched about it.
T1
we send
KT?
T1 KT, real psyched about that.
Yep.
And then we get to watch the final again.
Yeah. Nice.
Nice.
Yeah.
Another best of five.
You know, I think that whichever makes it Gen.G or KT, they're going to be great second seeds.
Exactly.
Whoever makes
because
it-
like we don't need to talk about the final, by the way, guys, because T1 wins, and you can see here it's on the page.
Listen.
They beat these two teams.
I can
before.
promise you guys one thing, okay? And hold me to it, all right?
I will
Do
not
it,
read the YouTube
internet.
comments.
Not that, but I can promise you guys in the grand finals we'll get at least 3 games of League of Legends. Guaranteed.
Nice.
I promise.
That's pretty brave, Wolf. I don't know.
And I think that, like, that's a lot. There's a whole crowd there. It could be long games, even. So it could be, like, high value, actually. So
Yeah.
I'd say at
We should
least
show
3.
up.
It could be 4 or 5. It could be. You guys
you know
might
what-
even get a bonus.
Do you know what I also think we'll get? We'll get this like really cool pre-show and intro segment that's gonna be so
cool video.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Good casters. At least 3 casters.
it'll be 3 of them. Will they be good? Will they be bad? We don't know, but it'll be
At least
3.
2 deskers as well.
Well, actually, it's even more than that. There'll be 6 casters, and we can guarantee that they'll be good. Because Sanke and Custom are
you're
both
right.
amazing.
Yeah.
Cloud Templar he's amazing
Thank
too.
you, Atlas. You
Yeah.
saved it.
That
You
new
got the
guy,
angle.
Yeah.
He's got
Also,
great
at least
predictions.
1 translator?
Yeah. We get a G-Sun?
Yeah.
That's a big win.
Guaranteed
So-
G-Sun.
And the reason why is I actually think
sorry,
that
everyone.
no, I thought it was great. The way that T1 bounced back after the KT series to me just further solidified like they're the best, right? Like if they had looked worse after the T1 KT series, I'd be like,
Maybe
but I
KT
think
were just that good.
well, no, I think KT are really good. But I also do think that if T1 picks Gen.G or T1 picks KT, that says something. That KT then brings them to what looked like a defeat and they barely claw it back. I don't think KT will be able to 3-2 them again in finals. If it ends up being KT, which I think makes complete sense because I do think that the semis will be very close.
I think KT have a better chance.
Oh, yeah, I'd say
Yeah.
so. But
I
to
feel-
I
me,
don't know if that's the difference between a 3-0 and a 3-1
Yeah.
or a better looking 3-0 compared to the other 3-0, which
Oh,
is
no,
more
I
of
do
a
agree.
stomp.
Yeah.
But I think that KT will look slightly better.
I'd agree.
We don't talk about T1 in a negative light basically ever this season so far because they have looked almost perfect at all times. The one angle for KT, and this is why I think KT has a better chance than Gen.G, is that Zeus has looked a little bit off.
Yeah.
And I mean like 10% off. And there have been some questionable engagements from some questionable moments in lane. And maybe Keen is actually totally on form, just like we saw in that series with T1 and KT. Like, maybe that's the angle. Because Keen getting 4 kills in that game was because Zeus was once again blinded into this Gnar pick, and he's like, I'm just going to take one for the team because I never lose lane, and you guys are going to get the other prio picks. And Keen punished him. And Keen's been the only player who's been able to do that. So
Yeah.
That's my angle for like maybe KT takes a game or two. We'll see. I'm not going to predict like the score or anything for finals until we actually see what happens
3-0.
in the losers final. But
I'm brave enough.
I do agree with you guys.
I'm not ready yet. I'm not ready yet.
Like I can see the fact that it was a 3-2 and a 3-1 against the two possible.
Yeah.
Like
So obviously
with
it's
less
gonna be
pressure, so I think that it'll be closer.
3 to
I'm-
1.5.
I'm with you guys. I think Genji will end up in finals, but I do think KT has a much better shot for the same reason that you're saying.
Yeah, it's like matchup specific. Like
Matchups-
Genji
yeah.
over KT stylistically works out, and then KT into T1 stylistically
I think they do
works out
better,
for
specifically
KT,
just
yeah.
because of Keen. I don't think anything else, because I think the bot lane matchup is still very heavily T1 favored, obviously. Mid lane matchup goes without saying.
It also feels like Paze and Delight have looked most nervous against T1.
Absolutely.
So
yeah, they look worse as well.
If there's anything, like, even though aiming and Lens didn't look great today against Hama Life Esports,
Lehans was, yeah.
I still think that they'll be at least calmer against T1.
No,
So I think that's also a thing to mention, because Paze and Delight, I don't know what it is, but maybe it's just the T1 effect.
Maybe it's just the
big match
first
effect.
match, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, flashbacks.
You don't
Yeah.
really ever know what's going on. Maybe they just had a bad day. Maybe it wasn't nerves at all.
Yeah, we don't really.
It's
I
just
agree.
us, trying
Yeah.
to guess. So
Because like
Yeah.
Wolf brought it up, like Zeus didn't look so good in their last series. I thought Carrier also had a bit of a rough time.
It was like it's.
he looked
it's-
uncomfortable, which
Yeah.
is something we'd never say.
It was weird, right? And I don't think that we see that again. I think it was like it was a weird situation
People
that
have
happened.
off days, right?
But I mean, if that's like actually more of a thing that's actually real instead of just being a one-day thing, then maybe there's an angle there. But I think if it's like T1 firing at all cylinders, then that's why we saw a 5-game series between T1 and KT, and we saw a 4-game series T1 and Genji, but we're still predicting 3-0s. Like, 'cause that's what I feel like needs to be explained, because like
yeah.
if I'm just like a layman that's come in to watch some Pogstate, like, what's this cool show? Let's learn about Korean League of Legends.
It's very specific if you're a layman.
If that happens, right? I'm like, but I just had a look at what happened in the past. You guys are idiots. Why are you predicting a 3-0? You've already seen that if it's KT, it's 5 games, and if it's Genji, it's 4.
it's also T1 who have been together at the same roster on a final stage.
Yeah.
I
And
mean,
that's what I think
It's
needs
probably
to be
going to be
explained.
one guy in the YouTube comments that's like, but they lost to DRX in World
But
Finals.
they lost to Genji last summer.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they still
okay.
made
0.
They still made this is their 5th final in a row.
Yeah.
Like,
So
get
I
out of
think
here.
there's some...
Yeah, very
there's a
little
lot
patience.
of stuff going to T1, And this was round 2. It was very
I
early
guarantee
on,
you
and
there will be at least 10 players on the Rift.
Wolf keeps swinging these promises, man. I
Yeah,
can't
man.
cash all these in.
KT's a great team. Genji's
bet
a
your
great
hair on
team. But I think T1 proved in 2 best of 5s that they were a better team, maybe even in certain moments, much better team. So
Yeah.
when it comes to a grand finals, where I think they'll even have more of a gap in terms of like little things like grand final stage, comfort levels, roster stuff, etc. I think they'll have even more of an edge
I
compared
think
to the best
there's-
of 5s we saw earlier in the playoffs.
There's a lot of cool stuff that happens storyline-wise if any of the 3 champions happen, right? So like if T1 wins, right, it's like, okay, another title for Faker on his 10-year anniversary, going into MSI. Maybe T1's actually going to win an international event with this roster. They look to be the best, blah, blah, blah. All the basic, like, cool storylines there. Genji back-to-back wins against T1 is super cool, even though they were the underdog, super
Only
hype.
Faker predicted them.
And then for KT, like, there's the most
I mean, there's a
interesting
million things
storylines,
for
right?
KT, right? Yeah.
But like,
Yeah.
no matter what happens, it's super hype. And I think that even though I myself I wouldn't say I've grown tired of, but I've come
A little bit.
I've been quite accustomed to T1 Genji finals now. I would like to experience something new,
Hey.
and so like I'm hoping that we
It's our
see something
comfort
new.
zone.
But you know what? I think no matter what, it's going to be great.
We
That's
only
what I'm
had
trying
them
to
for a
say.
year. We had Dom won finals before that.
That's true.
Yeah,
True.
and then the year before. No wait, what was spring 2020? Was it? There was the T1 Genji as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, would be. Yeah, and then
Atlus.
summer.
That was
Dom, of
wasn't
course.
that the Genji Mega Glow Up season,
Might be.
2020?
Yeah, where they randomly just won. I don't
Yeah,
know.
and then I think they then the final in spring was a disaster. I don't know.
Yeah, it's remarkable that like Zeus and Carry can have the games that they did, and we'd be like, oh man, they're looking worse. It's just because their normal form is just dumb.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
particularly with Zeus, like this is something
But the fact that the rest of the players step up so much,
Yeah, of
like
course.
that's what makes me, you can't predict against this team.
No, and but what really gets me, and this is something that I think in Zeus's case most notably, and this happens with top laner a lot. I think Doran also, even though he's way worse, has this happen a lot, where they will get no resources in draft ever from a team. They'll like get solo killed a bunch of times, and the rest of the team is winning, and they're like, "What is this player doing?" And it just always.
And they never get an answer.
Yeah, it just always gets me because, and I think that top lane is suffering this most because top lane counterpick matters the most in the game, and then you just sit there and they just still win the game. As I think Zeus' Silas game was a really good example, and maybe this is a segue to internet toxicity and why it's bad and why you shouldn't do it, why it really gets to me.
It's not good. Don't do it.
Yeah. It's bad to be a jerk. But no, it's okay. I don't think we need to have the internet toxicity conversation, mainly because I don't think we can fix it. So
Yes, we can be good role models, Atlus.
I think we are good role models. That's the whole point of Challengers, man.
Yeah.
The Challengers League
Remember
exists for the four of us to teach people not to be mean.
Precisely, yeah.
Remember not 2 episodes ago where we were like only positive stuff and then we just continued to shit on teams for like an hour straight? Yeah, I remember that.
I remember when I said
Great
I wasn't going to
role
read the
models.
comments, and I read some of the comments.
Yeah.
Stay positive, gang. Come on.
We'll always have challenger.
Yeah.
And if you feel like
Challengers actually is.
no, this is the thing. So like, if you ever feel like
The
the world
whole
has become
upcoming
too negative,
week.
that you're having these experiences where your favorite player is not being treated with the the respect that you want him treated with, and all
Be
this sort of
toxic
stuff.
back. That's right. Tell them what's
No,
what.
not even as a joke, Wolf. Come on.
I need to see some good quote retweets, and I need to see some really sick comebacks. I think the comeback game is pretty weak right now.
Don't burn. Don't do it. Come
What I
on.
was
Don't
gonna
listen
say
to Wolf.
Is we've got Challenger playoffs that's happening
sorry,
all this
everyone.
week as well, and so if you need some positivity, that's where you can come,
Because if you're
you'll always
negative,
get it.
you get banned
Yeah.
by us
Yeah.
immediately. It's
And
perfect.
if it's Chronicler, then you're let off a little bit easy.
Sometimes.
If it's me, I ban-hammer you into
Valdes,
the ground.
insta-ban.
Immediate.
Yeah.
Atlas,
Immediately.
insta-ban.
Yeah, I like to talk about my bans when it happens. Like, Valdes just doesn't care. If you say
a
something naughty,
Terminator.
like, he will just destroy you and not
Yeah.
even blink. He just doesn't care about
He's
it.
a silent
that's
killer.
safe
They
bet.
deserve
Valdes
it.
actually bans people in the middle of play-by-play cast. You might have thought Valdes hiccuped that one time, but it was actually just him going and banning 3 people.
I need to deal with this right now. I have a job
Those
to
are the
do.
ways. Yeah, you gotta get
It's
the
like,
stream of
I'm alive T1, I'm gonna let you finish, but I just need to ban the heck out of
Forrest,
this.
calm down a little bit, okay? I need to ban this nerd.
Oh, that's beautiful. So we have completely digressed, and I think we've also been here for quite some time, so I think we can wrap this one up. Thankfully, we will be back for an MSI episode. I hope you guys have enjoyed the Pogstate this year. We have absolutely loved making it for you guys, and I hope that you enjoy both the lower bracket final as well as the grand final immediately afterwards. So thank you so much for watching, and stay classy. See you next time.